in this video, we're going to UV map 3D objects. So let's start with a very basic one first. Start with this sphere. And I'm going to very quickly just create a material and put a texture on it. Now, this first texture that we're working with, this texture of the Earth, was already designed for the sphere primitive, but this gives us an opportunity to discuss the UVs for a full-on 3D primitive as opposed to just a plane or a 2D object. So let's go ahead and open up our UV editor. And let's select our sphere so we can actually see it here. We can toggle the image of the actual texture we've used by selecting this this icon here. That toggles our actual image here. And we can start to get an idea of what the UVs for a 3D object are actually like. What UVs essentially are? They are 3D objects laid flat. So let's go over some more features in the UV editor since we didn't really have a chance to in the previous video. We can zoom in and out just as we could in the viewport. In fact, I'll do it in the viewport as well. We can toggle our texture on and off in the UV editor, as I just demonstrated. With the texture toggled on, we can actually play around with this slider over here and make the texture brighter or darker to make it easier for us to work with as we move around our UVs, if we have to move around our UVs. In this particular instance, we don't actually have to because this texture was designed for this basic sphere, for the basic sphere primitives UV layout, so we don't actually have to do any sort of additional work to this, but we will in a little bit with a different primitive and different textures. So just to give you an overview, we also have, what else do we have? We have the UV toolkit right here. Very important to use the UV toolkit. If you don't see it here, it might just be because you need to go to Tools. You can go to Tools and hide the UV kit. You can also show the UV kit. You can also see the UV kit, the UV toolkit right here, and just toggle it that way. But lots of ways to get the UV toolkit to show up. Again, Maya has lots of ways of doing the exact same thing. Next thing, let's go over what happens if we select some components and do some component stuff here. So I'm going to select a few faces here, and I am going to move them around a little bit. You will notice as I move them around in the viewport, nothing is happening in the UV editor. That is because any movements that you make in the viewport are independent from movements that you make in the UV editor. That said, you don't want to be moving around faces or vertices or edges all willy-nilly after you've applied a texture. Usually when you're applying a texture to something, it's because you're finished working with that asset and you're not going to edit it anymore. But if you were to move it around, nothing would happen to the actual image except that it would have to stretch to compensate for whatever movements you're applying here. Meanwhile, in the UV editor, if we do the same thing, let's go ahead and just select some faces. You will notice we get the exact opposite situation here. We are moving the faces here in the UV editor, but it's not actually affecting our faces out in the viewport. You can tell the faces have not moved around at all. I can scale if I want to. I can rotate them if I want to. And it's not affecting our viewport faces at all. It is affecting the texture, but that's different than actually affecting the geometry of the object. It's affecting the texture and it's, causing the image to swim around as needed in order to compensate for my movements here, but it's not actually, it's not actually causing the geometry of my sphere to change around at all. I can do this with edges if I want to. I can do this with vertices. And of course, we have these two other components here. We have the UV selection, which we covered in the previous video, how these are the invisible fourth component, separate from faces, vertices, and edges. These are the things you're most commonly going to be manipulating in the UV editor, but you can also move around literal faces, literal edges, and literal vertices in the UV editor without fear that they will affect the actual geometry of your object in the viewport. If you're playing with vertices or edges or faces in the UV editor, rest assured, all it's going to do is just get the texture to swim around a little bit and not actually cause any weird things to happen with your geometry, just with your UVs. And we can also select UV shells, which is a continuous. UV shells are continuous UVs that have no breaks in between them. And we're going to get to that a little bit later when we talk about UV unwrapping. because UV unwrapping is going to involve the process of cutting up our UVs into smaller pieces, or in this case, smaller islands or smaller shells, as the naming convention goes with Autodesk Maya. UV mapping and UV unwrapping are the two main actions that we perform in this editor. So far, all we have done is UV mapped stuff. Oh, one more thing I can't show. One more thing I can demonstrate is the fact that if I were to move this whole UV shell, I can, or just select everything, marquee style, but I'd rather just select the whole UV shell because that's safer. If I were to move this over down here, you will notice that the texture has not disappeared. That is because whatever texture you apply in your UV editor is tiled. It's not obvious, you don't see it in every single one of these tiles next to the Earth, but it is. So there is an image of the Earth here. As you can see, there's an image of the Earth here. As you can see, image on the Earth to the right, image of the Earth to the left, image of the Earth directly below. It is tiled infinitely throughout this UV editor. Well, not infinitely, but it's tiled for. Actually, no, I'm going pretty far. It's still showing. So yeah, no, it's tiled infinitely. Tiled infinitely, you just can't see it. Most of the time, though, when you work with a UV editor, you're going to try and keep things just to this one, just to this one square here. You're not going to be moving your UVs around out here unless it's just to make space as you're laying things as you lay things around your scene. And we'll see that in action later on. All right, let me close the UV editor for now and go back just to the viewport. But let's do something else with this basic texture that I have here. In the previous videos, whenever we have applied a texture, we usually only applied it to the color, but we can actually apply our texture to other stuff here in the materials attribute editor. So let's apply it to transparency and see what happens. Let's apply that same file there. So I'm going to go through the process, find that earth texture. There it is. Let's apply it. Look at that. Essentially, what's going on here is that the Earth's oceans are closer to the color black than the Earth's land, especially the polar regions, Antarctica and the North Pole here. Because of that, transparency, the way it works is that if you were to ever apply a texture to it, whether it's a special transparency texture or just, regular textures from that are supposed to be used for other stuff like color, the closer to black something is, the more transparent it is, and the closer to white something is, the more solid it's going to look, which is why we get this fun little effect with the Earth where the oceans are all transparent and the land is not as transparent. That's pretty cool. All right, but let's do something else now. Let's go ahead and undo this. So I'm going to go ahead and just click on the actual Earth geometry to get back to the attribute editor and right-click over transparency to break the connection to go back to normal. Let's add in a bump map, because I do have a special bump map for this Earth that I found that I want to apply, so we can discuss what's going on there. Let's go ahead and click on the arrow next to bump value, folder, week 5. I have the Earth bump texture here. Bump maps, which are black and white maps, essentially are a fancy texturing trick to add detail and depth, to give the illusion that there's more modeling going on here than there really is. I have the illusion of some detail here, some little bumps that I modeled in, but in reality, this is still just the basic sphere with the basic sphere geometry that I haven't done anything with. This is just a trick of fancy texture work, which is very useful. Some things we can do now that we have this bump map. We can go into the bump map menu here. And first of all, we can change the color space to raw, so that will help add in more detail. Initially, the color space was sRGB, which is fine for something that's supposed to have color, like actual color. But for bump maps that use maps that are specifically always just going to be in black and white, you want to change the color space over to, under utility, to raw. Next thing we can do, let's go ahead and open up the Hypershade window so that we can review our material information. You've noticed, as I was creating the, I'll close the Hypershade. You'll notice that as I was creating the bump map, we had a menu that we had to go through with two things called bump value and bump depth and bump depth. And now I can no longer find that menu, right? So what do you do after you apply the bump mapping and you can't find that special menu with the bump value and the bump depth and the bump depth? You have to go into the hypershade. So let's open up the hypershade now and properly go through this. All right, here in the hypershade, let's go ahead and actually see our Earth material as a node network. We're not going to be doing that much work with nodes in this class, but I do want to introduce how useful they can be to edit certain things about your to edit certain features in regards to texturing. So let's go ahead and let's select our Earth material. Let's hold the right mouse button and hit graph and let go when we're over graph network. And now we have the nodes for node network for this this Earth material. If I were to zoom out, you can see I can just test that, but if I zoom out and go away, I can press F just to center it, just to center my camera on my node network, just as I did with the, just as I can do with regular objects, in the viewport. So from here, we can play around with a whole bunch of settings. If we select Earth material, we can play around with the main attribute editor that we can also play around with here in the viewport. Let's go ahead and make the hypershade really big, just so we can see more clearly what's going on here. Make the property editor big so we can also see what's going on there. So selecting Earth material brings out all that attribute stuff from the viewport that we saw before. If I were to select this purple one with bump value, this is where I get that menu with the bump value and the bump depth that I skipped over when I was applying the bump map for the first time. So at this point, I can start playing around with the bump value and the bump depth. Namely the bump depth, not the bump value. But the bump depth you can play around with to make your bump map sharper or softer, depending on your needs. It was at 1, but I'm going to go ahead and make it a little bit softer, just like that. I think that looks pretty nice. Make the hypershade big again. What else can we do? If we select this Earth texture here, this... not this Earth texture, this bump texture right over here. This is where we can actually change our color space from raw back to sRGB if we want to. We can also change the Earth texture from sRGB to raw if we want to, but for regular color textures, you don't want to do that. Essentially, like with everything in Maya, there are multiple different ways of doing the exact same thing. The node way has a lot more options to work with, but obviously can be a little bit tricky to navigate. So I'm not going to require node navigation for your work in this class, but it is important to note that you can play around with these settings here in the hypershade via the node network, and not just via viewport attribute editors. Maybe I can make it even softer like this. Looks pretty nice here in the preview with my shader ball. And looking at it here, looks pretty nice there too. Let me get some shininess where we can see some of the topology pop out, but nothing too crazy. Nice. That looks pretty good. Not too bad. And we can see the bump map is doing some very nice work, adding some nice little additional details that I didn't actually model in, but the bump map did all the work of providing the illusion of extra depth and extra detail. So nice. Excellent. In this next section, I'm going to work with these two cubes to apply a Rubik's Cube texture to this one and a dice texture to this one. And now we're going to be introduced a little bit to UV unwrapping. Obviously, unlike the Earth material that I worked with for most of the video thus far, this one is not aligned correctly with my cube, so I have to do some additional work with this in the UV editor. So with my cube selected, I'm going to jump over to my UV editor here, and we're going to see what we can do about this. All right, so the basics of UV unwrapping, essentially, you are going to select, in this case, I'm going to select edges, all of these edges, because I am going to need to cut them and separate them, because the way that my UVs are, that the way my texture is laid out here, I can't manipulate this UV shell, this continuous set of UVs to fit properly onto the image that I have here. So I have to work around it. I have to manipulate my UVs in a way that I haven't yet before. To do that, I have to do some basic UV unwrapping. So let's go ahead and I'm going to switch over to edge mode. I'm going to select certain edges here. And then I am going to go over to my cut and sew. I can also find cut and sew here in the UV toolkit. Doesn't matter which way you do it. And I'm going to cut. There's also a shortcut for that. It's Shift X and also Shift S to sew, but we'll get to sewing later. All right. So now that I've done that, now that I've cut these edges, I now have separate UV maps. I have separate UV shells, I should say. I have this one. I have that one. I have this one. I have this one. And I have this one. And now all I'm going to do is put them in place, like a little puzzle. And then get to work UV mapping them, very similar to the way I UV mapped the stop sign and the Joker card in the previous video. All right, there we go. There's my Rubik's Cube UV mapped properly. I actually won't do any sewing since I don't have to in this case. Although I suppose I could show really quick what sewing looks like. Essentially, you just select two edges that are, just by selecting two edges like this, you can go ahead and just sew them back together if you want to create a continuous UV map. In this case, I don't actually have to do that, since the way my UV texture is laid out doesn't actually require it, but there will be a situation later on, I believe in the next video, that will demonstrate where sewing will be more required. So we won't worry about sewing just yet, just cutting. This looks pretty good for my Rubik's Cube texture. Let's go back to normal here, because now that I have this, I also have a bump map with the exact same UV layout, so I can go ahead. Let's find it. By the way, if you can't immediately find your material here, you can just go ahead and click left and right. But actually, I'm going to go ahead and delete my history here, because that should help. There we go. That helps get rid of a whole bunch of stuff from my attribute editor. Just go to Rubik's material. All right, let's do the same thing with this one. But I'm going to use a dice texture. So let's do the same thing again. Okay. Not bad for quick demo work here. Let's go ahead, go back into my regular view, because I can go ahead and use the same exact dice texture as a bump map, because a dice is just black and white, so I don't have to make a separate second map for this. Okay, and for a finishing touch, I think I can use the modeling toolkit here. Just add in a bevel for this dice. Doing this early means that you will have more geometry to work with in the UV editor. So it's recommended you do something like a bevel last. Not too bad for a quick demo. So that is UV mapping and UV unwrapping for 3D objects. Next time, we're going to continue working with UV unwrapping for yet another object. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.